Most people picture knights settling duels with swords, but in real late medieval fights, especially in full armor, the sword often wasn't the main tool. The weapon that keeps showing up in serious duels is the poleaxe, a compact pole weapon built to strike hard, control distance, and force openings in armor. In this video, we'll explain why knights chose it, how it worked in close combat, and what that reveals about what dueling actually looked like. Number 1. The sword myth. Most people hear knight and instantly picture a shiny sword. That image makes sense because the sword was the badge of status. It showed you had money, training, and the right to fight as a mounted warrior. You could wear a sword in public, swear oaths on it, pose with it in art, and pass it down as an heirloom. In a dubbing ceremony, the sword was right there as part of the message. You're not just armed. You're part of a social class with duties and privileges. Swords also come in familiar shapes that are easy to romanticize. The one-handed arming sword, the longer hand-and-a-half sword, the big two-handed longsword. But when it came to a serious duel, especially the kind that happened in full armor, the sword was often not the main tool for the job. Part of the confusion comes from mixing different kinds of fights. A street fight, a raid, a skirmish, a battlefield melee, a judicial duel, and a tournament bout can all involve knights, but the best weapon changes with the setting. In late medieval Europe, a duel wasn't always a casual one-on-one fight. It could be a judicial combat meant to settle a legal dispute, a formal duel of honor, or a tournament combat meant to prove skill in front of witnesses. In those settings, the goal was not swordplay for style. The goal was control and a clear result the rules recognized. Disarming, forcing a surrender, or putting an opponent in a position where he could not continue.
A sword can do some of that, but against heavy armor, it has built-in limits. The cutting power that looks so impressive in movies doesn't matter much when the target is wrapped in layers, padded cloth, chainmail, and later on, shaped steel plates. Even when swords are used in duels, they're often doing jobs people don't expect, more like a stiff tool for thrusting and prying than a slicing blade. That's why knights, who were practical professionals, leaned on other weapons that interacted with armor better. They still carried swords, because a sword is versatile and always useful when armor is lighter, when you're on horseback and need a sidearm, or when the fight breaks into chaos. But in a planned duel between armored elites, the weapon that takes center stage is usually something else.
Number 2. Armor changes everything. To see why the sword loses center stage, you have to picture what full armor really means. Early medieval protection in Western Europe often meant a thick padded coat, a gambeson, and if you were wealthy, a mail shirt made of thousands of linked iron rings. Mail is flexible and excellent against slashes, but it still needs padding underneath because blunt force can hurt even when a blade doesn't cut through. As time went on, armor didn't jump straight from mail to perfect plate. Many fighters wore coats of plates, or brigandine's cloth, or leather garments lined with overlapping metal plates, because they offered solid protection without the cost of a full harness. Over time, elites added plates to the most exposed areas: knees, elbows, shins, forearms, shoulders. By the 1300s and 1400s, this grew into what many people imagine as classic knight armor, a full harness of shaped steel plates worn over padding and usually combined with mail in the gaps. The key word is shaped. A breastplate isn't a flat sheet. It's curved, sometimes ridged, and designed so blows slide off rather than bite in. Helmets like the bassinet and later the sallet or armet protect the head with hardened steel and a visor. Gauntlets protect the hands, which are usually the first thing to get hit in any weapon fight. All of that changes the math of a duel. A normal sword cut that would be deadly against cloth or bare skin can turn into a loud scrape against plate. It can still knock the opponent around, but it's not reliably finishing the fight. There's also the issue of edge damage. Repeated hard impacts against armor can nick or dull a blade, which matters when you're counting on the sword for later. That doesn't mean swords were useless. Knights adapted. They aimed thrusts at weak spots, gaps at the joints, the face opening of the helmet, the armpit, the inside of the elbow, behind the knee, the groin area where plates meet.
They also use techniques modern people call half-swording, where the fighter grips part of the blade with a gauntleted hand to guide the point with more precision. In some sources, you even see the sword used like a short impact tool, with the hands on the blade and the hilt components used to strike. Because armor turns a lot of fights into a contest of shock and balance. The common thread is that the sword stops being a simple cutting weapon and starts behaving like a tool for finding openings. That works, but it asks a lot from the fighter. It usually means closing distance, staying safe while you do it, and dealing with an opponent who is also trained and protected. In a duel, getting that close without losing control is a whole problem by itself. So, knights favored weapons that could pressure an armored opponent from farther out, hit with more force, and still give control when the distance collapsed.
Number 3. The poleaxe. If you remember one weapon from armored duels, make it the poleaxe, also spelled pollaxe in English sources. The pole part relates to the head of the weapon, which hints at how people thought about it. Not a simple axe, but an engineered head mounted on a haft. Think of it as a purpose-built knightly tool for fighting in armor on foot. It sits in the same category as high-end armor, designed for elite use, not improvised from farm work. A typical poleaxe is around a man's height, sometimes a bit shorter for tight-list fields, with a head that combines multiple functions. One side may have an axe blade, the other side is often a hammer face or a flanged beak that concentrates force into a smaller area. On top, there is usually a spike for thrusting. Many examples also have a spike at the bottom of the shaft, sometimes called a butt spike, which turns the whole weapon into a two-ended threat. The shaft is commonly reinforced with metal strips called langettes, because in armored combat, weapons clash hard, and an opponent may try to damage the wooden haft. You also sometimes see round handguards, little metal discs, placed to protect the hands during close-range work. In French sources, you may see terms like hache d'armes, axe of arms, which again signals a weapon tied to the fighting class, not a tool from the woodshed. This design is basically a Swiss Army knife for armored fighting. You can strike with the hammer side to send shock through armor. You can thrust with the top spike into openings. You can use the axe edge to hook or drag at an opponent's weapon, shield, or body. You can shove with the haft, block with it, and use it as a lever. All of that matters because armor encourages fighters to take risks. If a lot of attacks bounce off, the fight naturally becomes more physical and more about controlling space. A long, two-handed weapon with multiple striking surfaces is perfect for that. It also gives reach, and reach buys time. It lets you threaten an opponent before he can get close enough to wrestle or stab. People sometimes confuse the poleaxe with the halberd, but they're not the same thing. A halberd is usually longer and is strongly tied to infantry formations and guard units, while the poleaxe is very often shown in the hands of armored men fighting one-on-one or in small numbers. The poleaxe is also built to be handled in tighter spaces, with more emphasis on close control, not just long, sweeping cuts. When you look at late medieval fight books, training manuals, written for the kind of people who actually wore armor, the poleaxe keeps showing up as a main event weapon. That's not a coincidence. It's the tool that matches the problem armor creates. Number 4. Built for formal duels. Another reason the poleaxe became the dueling favorite is that late medieval duels were often organized events. If two nobles agreed to fight in harness inside a list field, there were rules, judges, barriers, and sometimes very specific weapon choices set ahead of time. Some combats were arranged as part of tournaments, others were challenges to settle honor or disputes. Either way, you often see a controlled environment, a fenced space, officials ready to stop the fight, and agreed equipment. In some regions and periods, older styles of trial by combat could use different gear, like shields with staves or clubs. But once full plate armor becomes normal for elites, the weapons that dominate elite foot combats tend to be pole weapons. The poleaxe fits that world. It's dangerous enough to be respected, but it's also controllable. It doesn't rely on slicing flesh. It relies on impact, leverage, and forcing openings. That lines up with how armored fights actually end. Many formal combats end when one fighter is thrown, pinned, disarmed, or forced to yield. Not because someone got neatly cut down. The poleaxe helps produce those outcomes because it acts like a lever. With a sword, a lot of your power comes from edge alignment and the swing. With a poleaxe, a lot of your power comes from body weight, two-handed control, and the ability to steer the opponent's balance. A long haft gives leverage. Leverage lets you move people. And moving people in armor is how openings appear. There's also a safety and rulebook angle. Tournament culture often separated weapons meant for real war from weapons set up for sport. Sometimes points were blunted, edges were dulled, or special tips were used to reduce the risk of lethal injury in public events. A poleaxe can be prepared for that kind of controlled violence while still functioning as a serious test of skill.
And because it's a two-handed weapon, it tends to keep both fighters in a more measured distance game at the start, rather than immediately turning into a knife fight. It's also worth remembering that duels could involve several weapons across phases. A famous example is the French judicial duel of 1386 between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Glis, where the fight moved through mounted lance work, then close fighting, and then the final phase at grappling distance. You don't need every detail to see the pattern. Formal duels often start with longer weapons and only end up with swords and daggers when the distance collapses. In that late medieval context, the poleaxe is the weapon built to dominate the key middle distance, where you can hurt an armored opponent and still keep control.
Number 5. Close range, dagger, and grappling. Even with poleaxes, many duels end up at very close range. Armor makes fighters brave because a lot of scary-looking attacks bounce off. That confidence pushes people into clinches, shoves, and trips. Medieval knights didn't treat grappling as some cheap trick. It was a core skill, taught and practiced on purpose. Wrestling traditions were strong across Europe, and many fight manuals mix weapon work with throws and holds as if it's the most normal thing in the world. In armor, grappling can be even more effective because you can grab solid steel edges, pull on a shoulder plate, or push on a helmet without shredding your hands the way you might against a bare blade. When the fight gets that close, a small weapon becomes extremely practical. The dagger. Knights carried daggers constantly. Some were everyday knives. Others were stiff, narrow designs like the rondel dagger, built to thrust rather than slash. The point here isn't gore, it's mechanics. Armor has seams and openings, especially where the body needs to move, under the arms, at the elbows, around the visor, behind the knees. A dagger can reach places that are awkward for a long weapon once bodies are tangled. It also gives a fighter a way to threaten an opponent who is pinned or controlled. In some cases, Just drawing the dagger could change the situation because it signals this is now close and serious, which can trigger a yield in a formal setting where surrender is allowed and even expected once you're beaten. The sword sometimes shows up here too, but again, not as the graceful cutting weapon people imagine. In armor, swords are often used in short, tight actions, thrusting, pressing, or using the hilt as an impact tool, because there isn't much room for wide swings. The overall picture is that armored duels are not two men fencing politely with blades. They are physical contests where weapons, armor, and wrestling all connect.
The poleaxe shines because it transitions well into that range. You can fight at reach, then slide your grip and keep working when you're practically chest to chest. Number 6. The knight's other real weapons. If the poleaxe was a star in armored duels on foot, it wasn't the only weapon knights trusted more than swords. On horseback, the lance was the king of impact. A mounted duel, like a joust, is basically a specialized contest built around the lance, with armor tweaks, scoring systems, and rules that changed over time. In war, the spear and lance family mattered even more. For much of medieval history, the most common primary weapon on the battlefield, across classes, was some kind of spear. Reach is a big deal in real combat, and spears are efficient to make and devastating in a formation. Knights are famous for swords, but in battle, a knight's first hit is often delivered with a lance, and if he ends up on foot in a press of bodies, he may grab a pole weapon because it works in that crowded space. Blunt weapons also deserve their reputation. Maces and warhammers are easy to understand. As armor gets better at resisting cuts, blunt force and concentrated impact become more attractive. A mace can dent, shake, or break through lighter defenses, and it can hurt through armor by transferring shock. A warhammer often has a hammer face on one side and a spike or beak on the other, giving both blunt impact and a concentrated point. There are also specialized pole weapons that lean into the same idea: hammerheads, beaks, spikes, and hooks. This is also a good moment to clear up a common myth. People love the idea of medieval fighters swinging big chain flails, but those are far less common in real evidence than movies suggest. Knights and professional soldiers generally favored weapons that were reliable, controllable, and safe for the user in tight formations. The poleaxe, mace, hammer, spear, and lance fit that pattern. Swords stay in the kit because they're handy, they're quick to draw, and they work well when armor is lighter or when you need a sidearm. But when both fighters show up in serious plate, the real weapons tend to be the ones that punch, spike, or control. Number 7. What the sources actually show. It's easy to say knights used poleaxes and leave it there. But the interesting part is how strongly the evidence lines up from different angles. Start with the fight books of the 1400s and early 1500s. These manuals were written for people who could afford armor, training, and time, basically the knightly and noble class, plus their professional instructors. When those books cover fighting in armor, they spend a lot of attention on pole weapons and on the kind of close-range wrestling that armor encourages. You see names like Fiore dei Liberi in Italy, Hans Talhofer in the German lands, and other traditions that teach armored combat as a complete system: poleaxe or spear at distance, then controlled entry, then grappling and dagger work. There's even a French text titled Le jeu de la hache, the play of the axe, focused specifically on armored axe or poleaxe fighting. A whole manual dedicated to that weapon tells you what people thought was worth studying. Then you have artwork and chronicles. Tournament scenes often show armored men on foot with poleaxes inside fenced list fields, watched by officials and crowds. Chronicles describing challenges and formal combats frequently mention the weapons agreed on, and poleaxes appear as an expected choice for foot combat.
This lines up with how late medieval elites wanted to display themselves, not as random brawlers, but as skilled professionals performing under rules. Finally, there are the surviving objects. Poleaxes and related weapons preserved in collections show careful design, reinforced hafts, complex heads, and fittings built for repeated hard impacts, not for chopping wood. Some have decorative touches too, because status never fully disappears, even in a weapon made for efficiency. There's also a simple storytelling reason the sword dominates modern imagination. A sword is easy to wear, easy to recognize, and easy to turn into a personal symbol in poems and legends.
A poleaxe is awkward to carry around town, and it's tied to very specific situations: armored foot combat and disciplined warfare. So it shows up more in technical sources than in romance stories. That gap between story culture and practical fighting culture is one of the main reasons people are surprised when they see what the training manuals actually focus on. Put all of that together, and the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The late medieval duel between armored elites isn't centered on the sword the way pop culture suggests. It's centered on specialized weapons and on skills that look more like controlled force than elegant fencing. Armor pushes the fight toward leverage, balance, and targeting the few places steel can't fully cover. Number 8. How knights chose weapons in real life. Knights didn't live in a world where you picked one weapon and that was your whole identity. A well-equipped man might have a lance for mounted fighting, a sword as a constant sidearm, a dagger for close work, and a pole weapon for when he expected to fight on foot in armor. The choice depended on the event and the setting. A battlefield is chaotic. You might start mounted, lose your horse, end up fighting in tight space, and grab whatever works. A formal duel is different. It's planned, it has witnesses, and it's often tied to reputation, legal claims, or public honor. That planning encourages best tool for the job thinking. If both men are in armor, then the weapon needs to interact with armor realistically. That is why you see poleaxes, hammers, and specialized thrusting tools, not just swords. Logistics matter too. Knights rarely carried everything themselves at the last minute. Squires and servants helped arm them, carry spare weapons, and manage equipment. In a tournament setting, the gear could be tuned to the event. A specific type of helmet for better vision, extra reinforcement in certain areas, or weapon heads prepared to match agreed rules. In war, the kit might be rougher and more varied, because the goal is survival and victory, not clean judging. Social incentives also shaped weapon choice. Capturing a wealthy opponent for ransom could be more valuable than killing him, and formal combats often allowed surrender once a fighter was clearly beaten. Weapons that let you control and overpower an opponent, pin him, disarm him, force him off balance, fit that culture, especially when everyone involved understood that the point was a decisive outcome in front of witnesses. That's why late medieval weapon lists and descriptions so often pair the sword with other tools. A dagger for close work, and a pole weapon for the main clash in armor. In some formal combats, fairness mattered so much that the weapons had to match same length, same general head shape, sometimes even provided or inspected by officials before the fight began. In written challenges and tournament rules, the wording can sound almost technical because on foot, in harness, with axes isn't a vibe, it's a format. Some household inventories even note an axe for the harness kept with the armor, the way you'd store a tool with the kit it belongs to, ready for the next muster or tournament day, as needed.